Manish, thank you very much for taking time out. We all know you very very well. Through your writings, through your videos, hearing you in person. But just for everyone's benefit, Manish is chairman and co-founder of Team Lease Services, one of India's leading staffing and human capital firm. They are implementing India's first vocational university and the National PPP Apprenticeship Program. The company has hired 1.8 million employees over the last 15 years, figures which are very relevant as we talk about the job crisis naturally in our country today. Manish is a member of the National Skill Mission Central Advisory Board of Education and has served on various policy committees for education, employment, and employability. He also serves as an independent director on the board of the Reserve Bank and a member of the advisory board of the CAG. Manish has got his MBA from the Wharton School and is an alumnus of Sri Ram College, Delhi and Mayo College, Ajmer. Manish, we are really very, very grateful and thankful to you for spending your evening with us. Eagerly looking forward to hear your views on, you just heard us speak about one of our key mission pillars on ease of doing business. So love to hear your views and your experiences as well, and anything you would like the chamber to do going forward. So over to you, Manish.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sudhir. It's a pleasure to be here. It's obviously a challenging time for everybody, but it's creating new habits, and I wonder whether this would sort of be possible to do if COVID wasn't here. So I heard the ease of doing business conversation, and I would sort of love to take that forward. But I broadened the topic a little bit to talk about a policy window. And, you know, as somebody who's sort of been working on policy reform for, 15, 17 years now, I think that we have a unique opportunity here because of COVID. It would be horrible for me to say I was waiting for something like COVID, but the policy window is an important concept in political science, and I think we have a policy window here. But I think that policy window is obviously in the medium term and long term. In the short run, there are obviously three questions around COVID which nobody can answer, and I think too many people have been trying to answer. They are around the virus, around consumption, and around professions. And let me just briefly expand on every. I think nobody knows whether we are at the start, middle, or the end of the virus. So I think until we know that, it's really hard to plan. I think nobody knows whether consumers or companies will be frugal or will they be hedonistic. Will they live for today or will they save for a rainy day after this? This is really important because, we've all learned in the lockdown, we need to eat, but we don't need to eat out. So the need, want, and desire has sort of got clarified quite substantially. And so for us, it's quite clear that it's very difficult to model demand. Has there been some demand destruction? Will demand come? Will there be revenge consumption? I think that's a really difficult thing to model. And the third one, which is related to the first two, is there are too many professions, at least in India, which can't be done without social distancing. See, China's farm to non-farm transition happened to factories. India's farm to non-farm transition is happening to sales, customer service, and logistics. So the three fastest growing segments of India's job market in the last sort of 10 years have been sales, customer service, and logistics. And if you add construction and throw in hospitality and throw in a few others, then these professions can't be done working from home. So I think it's absolutely unmodelable in the short run. And I think it's been quite irresponsible to throw out numbers like India's unemployment rate was 28% in April, and now it's back to 8%. I mean, unemployment rate on Sunday afternoon is 75%, right? Because your office is closed. So customers have been forced on strike. And more importantly, India's problem is not unemployment, it is employed poverty. This is a case I've made for a long time, that India doesn't have a jobs problem, we have a wages problem. And if people are more interested, I can explain why I believe that, but I think that policy choice is really important. But net, I think we are all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And I have been quite surprised by the outrage at expressed at what's happening with MSMEs or what's happening with migrants, because these are pre-existing conditions. The Indian MSME, the Indian migrant have sort of been at the sharp edge of policy for a long time. And so these are not conflicts. These are trade-offs, right? All we can do in the short run, and that's why I'm going to end the short run part right now, is all we can do is ensure that the broadest shoulders bear the heaviest burdens. So all that policy can do in the short run is to say that the disease doesn't lead to death, unemployment doesn't lead to hunger, and working capital problems don't lead to bankruptcy. And that's why fiscal monetary policy has sort of focused on that. But I would submit that all people sort of thinking about India will do what the US has done or Europe has done in fiscal policy are not looking at our fiscal deficit. And saying that the RBI is not doing what the US Federal Reserve also don't understand the difference between us and the US in terms of what our capabilities are. So I think that it's important to sort of be ambitious in policy, but anybody who really wants to change policy really needs to think about how change actually happens. And I'd love to hear your experience with Bombay Chamber of Commerce. Is obviously much more, has a heritage and history, but at least what I've noticed is that India doesn't change for a better option. She changes when you have no option. And 1991 happened because we were bankrupt. But 1991 missed four important things. It missed formalization, it missed corruption, it missed education reform at a broad level, and it did really miss banking reform at a broader level. So I think, when the patient is in the ICU, you don't lecture them about quitting smoking or telling them to lose weight. But if the patient's in the ICU all the time, at some point, somebody's got to tell them to lose weight. And so my submission would be that John Kingdon was a political scientist, and he says that a policy window is when the problem, the solution, and the timing come together. And India's problems have been known for a long time. You could read the second 5-year plan document and get pretty much all of India's problems in details. Actually, India's solutions have been known for a long time. There is a report 20 years old in every area. You could change the date on the Kothari Committee report of education. You could change the date on the Rustomjee report on police reforms. In fact, Apprenticeship Act reform was the 20th point in Indira Gandhi's 20-point program in 1975. So if we know what is to be done, then why is there such a trip up in why it has to be done or how it has to be done? And I guess that's really where policy entrepreneurs will have to think about that, if we know what needs to be done and we sort of aren't spending time on how it needs to be done. And so the COVID policy window is really, I think, being forced and accelerated by four external trends, right? There is a new world of work. Employment has shifted from being a lifetime contract to a taxi cab relationship. There's a new world of education, in a world where Google knows everything, knowing is useless, learning how to learn is the key skill. And there's a new world of organizations, where if the average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company has come down from 65 years to 14, the first list of Fortune 500 came out in 1956, and an average Fortune 500 company would live 65 years, and now it lives only 14. So what's the value of a pension promise from a company that only lives 14 years? How long-term can it be? So I think that has been combining, that's been happening for many years. And now the China sort of incident at the border is being manifest in many ways in economic policy, but I think that was sort of also something that would have happened a long time ago. So I would say the COVID policy window requires us to do 5 things. It requires us to do compliance reform, it requires us to do banking reform, it requires us to do education reform, urbanization reform, and industrial reform. I'll spend time only on the first 2 because we can expand on the others. So compliance reform is the one which many of you mentioned, which is the ease of doing business reform. And for a long time, I have been arguing with the government that, our rising rankings in ease of doing business is a really good signaling value to investors outside India. But to change our life on a daily basis, you have to do it ground up. What are the compliances, filings, changes in India? And obviously, when we put out an infographic about a month ago, which took a year for us to put together. I mean, I have 165 guys in regulatory affairs whose full-time job is handling the regulatory cholesterol. So we put them on the job, and there are about 68,000 compliances. There are 6,700 filings. And this actually changed 8 times a day last year. So it's 8,000 changes a year. Now, when I first put these numbers out, Niti Aayog and everybody told me, oh, you're making these numbers up. So that's when we sort of put the infographic out. Now we've sent them a printout. In fact, now we put it on a website called teamleasecompliance.com, where we update with the 8 changes sort of every day. But the more tragic problem is that 8,000 out of these 67,000 compliances prescribe jail. So the criminalization, everybody got angry when there was criminalization for CSR, but India's existing laws have 8,000. You know, one of the most interesting lines in the Vishnu Sahasranam, which roughly translates to saying that why did God create fear? So he could take it away. You know, so the 8,000 criminalization is just a way to sort of harass MSMEs, harass large employers. It's a source of corruption. I don't think that there's 8,000 places that compliance defaults should be a criminal offense rather than a civil offense. And also, most importantly, a large chunk of this is now in states. So the 67,000 and 6,000 filings may not apply to a single company, but it compounds with geographic expansion, it compounds with headcount expansion, and it obviously compounds with size expansion. And we can give you any cut you want of which state you operate, how many states, which sector, and we can give you that cut. And obviously, you know, when we put this infographic, the government started harassing us, saying that how can we verify this? So we've created an app called Rules Book, which you can now download from the App Store at Android and configure yourself and see what the compliances for you are. But I would submit that this is also state versus center, right? And you know, many of us have viewed ease of doing business as being done from Delhi. Or some people said as well, it's all local. I think both extremes are wrong, right? Indira Gandhi in 15 of her speeches had said, strong states lead to a weak nation. India can't be run from Delhi. And N.T. Rama Rao very often used to say that the central government is a conceptual myth. India is run by its chief ministers. And I think both those extremes are wrong, but this ease of doing business sort of chart proves to us, or at least makes it obvious, that ease of doing business will have to happen at state governments and at the central government. So the way we think about it is, it's about 3 things. It's about rationalizing, it's about decriminalizing, and it's about digitization. I am a big fan of digitization, but I would submit if we digitize the 67,000 compliances, that would probably be a mistake. I mean, I think we need a compliance commission. You know, there are actually 3 kinds of reforms. There's flick of pen reforms, there's institutional reforms, and there's capacity reforms. Flick of pen reforms can be done in 90 days. Institutional reforms can be done in 1 year, and capacity building reforms will take 3 years. So I think ease of doing business is in the category of flick of pen reform. So you could have a 90-day compliance commission, either at a state government or at a central level, or at a ministry level, or at a department level. And this is the idea that is sort of seems to be getting some traction, where at the end of 90 days, they say, well, we will cut 50%. I mean, they're given a mandate to cut 50% of compliances, 50% of filings, and maybe even 50 or 75% of the criminal offenses being made sort of civil offenses. So I think rationalizing is a really important part, because you don't want to pave the cow path. I mean, you know, IT in government is always involved just writing code without re-engineering processes, and we've seen how that ends up. So I would submit rationalizing, decriminalization, and sort of digitizing are where we should focus on. I think banking reform is closely related to this, because for MSMEs, if you think about it, you know, India's credit to GDP ratio is only 50%. Now, China's 300% is the wrong number, but we should be at 100%. And I think financial sector banking reforms of creating more competition. India only had 97 banks in 1947. We only have 95 banks right now, scheduled commercial banks. I think we should have many more. So we should issue many more licenses. We should raise private sector governance. We should raise public sector governance. You know, we put 2 lakh crore into public sector banks in the last 2 years, yet their risk-weighted assets are lower than 2 years ago. And obviously, we need to raise our game in regulation and supervision, and we need to create more space for non-banks. In education reform, the new education policy, is really important, and I don't want to spend time telling you about that. If any one of you sort of think about it, then I'd be happy to answer any questions. So, in sort of wrapping up here, I think ease of doing business is an idea whose time has come. I think I still find an antibiotic reaction to my proposals around labor reform. You know, I find opposition still in saying, well, the Yes Bank experiment, so we should not issue many more bank licenses. I mean, I have an argument against all of them, but I think, if ease of doing business reform is like apprenticeship act reform, nobody really disagrees with me. But I think one of the biggest questions which I have in government after working with government for sort of 15 years is, what do you do after everybody who matters in government agrees with you, right? It's a very spiritual sort of intellectual level of agreement that, yes, we want to do it, but it never sort of gets done. So I'd say my lessons, at least in policy reform, is there's a difference between a list of ingredients and the recipe. Unfortunately, most committees have focused on the list of ingredients rather than thinking through the political economy of who is opposing it, what could be 4 stages in which to get it done. Can you get it done from a chief minister rather than doing everything in Delhi? I think the recipe versus list of ingredients is a really important sequencing that many of us, at least I hadn't thought of that in labor reform. And now that we do, we're probably making more progress. And that's sort of the recognition, as Avinash Dixit, he's one of my favorite professors at Princeton, probably would have got the Nobel Prize if he wasn't Indian, I think, but in economics. And he says that life is second best at best. He's a game theory proponent. And I think that the notion that reform is 100-0, if you propose it, I think you get 0. So I think we have a collective action problem. And this is, I know I'm saying this in front of a chamber of commerce, but I think that employers have a collective action problem because traditionally chambers have been pro-business rather than pro-markets. And I have been requesting all the chambers to sort of, I mean, I'm pro-business. I would love, a excise duty cut here, or a GST adjustment here, or an import duty there, or that, or a concessional interest rates. But I think that our collective effectiveness has been sabotaged because the collective action problem has been pro-business rather than pro-markets. And if you sort of think about reforms as being steady and sort of making India a better habitat for doing business, it's probably time for us in this COVID policy window to really figure out this recipe, figure out second best. I read a wonderful new biography of Dadabhai Naoroji, and he obviously introduced me to Bombay in ways that I didn't, but it's by Dinyar Patel. It just came out last month. And the wonderful description of Dadabhai Naoroji is that he was too radical for the moderates and he was too moderate for the radicals. And I think the only way we're actually going to get labor reform or education reform or banking reform is sort of thinking like that, yes, I know we need to be ambitious, but I think that there is now a clear path for us. So we don't need to be impatient where we propose 100-0 and we sort of get 0. So I'd sort of say the battle for ideas has been supercharged in the last 90 days. I think we've made more progress in these ideas of banking reform or labor reform or agricultural reform or sort of compliance, the new education policy. I have been working on many of these things for almost 10, 15 years, and it's fascinating to me how much traction they are getting in the last 90 days, either in Delhi, of course, but even in state capitals. And some state capitals are going to the other extreme, right? UP has suspended labor laws, which I think is not the right idea because then we will sort of have a backlash or an antibiotic reaction. So I think in reform, Paracelsus, he was a Renaissance physician. He used to say the dose makes the poison. Anything powerful enough to help has the power to hurt. But I think it's an absolute unique time right now for anybody who's interested in getting reform because we're pushing on an open door. And the COVID pain is almost forcing some of the changes and some of the openness of minds. So COVID is acting as a hearing aid for policymakers. I believe that these were pre-existing conditions, but I think they're seeing the situation more clearly. So, all we can do right now is, will we be successful? I don't know. One of my favorite letters of Nehru is from 1942 in Ahmednagar jail when he says that, whether we were successful or not, historians will judge, but we aimed high and looked far. And I think with ease of doing business, with banking reform, with education reform, chambers of commerce like yours have a really important part in fighting the battle for ideas. So should I pause here, or I can, expand on what I said, or whatever you'd like, Anjali and David?
Yeah, no, Manish, maybe you can complete your sharing your thoughts, and then I request Anjali to, to then take through the questions which members would have.
I mean,
Manish,
we can start with, yeah.
Yeah, we can just start. Manish, thank you so much for joining us today. It was very kind of you and to be so responsive and say, yes, you will speak to us. I mean, lots of food for thought here. And I know we have such an experienced group of people here in the virtual room, so to speak. So I will turn it over to comments, observations, and I'm sure some anecdotes from experience that we will hear from our board members here. Please either ask your question directly or post it and then I will ask it for you. Either way.
Anjali, can I come in? This is Prasad Chandran.
Yes, absolutely. Please do, Prasad.
Yeah. Manish, I'm particularly talking from the multinational companies who are operating in India. And the whole concept of ease of doing business and talking of attracting Indian into India, and particularly those of us who are already invested and who have been in the country for many, many years, and quite a few of us have Indian managing directors and a lot of them managing this. And for us to be told that this is good and that is good, because we know what the states are, we know what the central government does, and suddenly you have this Atmanirbhar. Now, are we going, the definition of Atmanirbhar is very confusing because different ministries gave at different levels of it. And internationally, in the international headquarters, that's causing a lot of confusion. Are we going back to the license days? Are we going back to restrictions? Because suddenly you hear it's a China situation, but you say from Hong Kong you cannot. And the world is very, very interconnected. What's your view on how do you define Atmanirbhar, particularly for the multinational headquarters as of now?
So I think that for India, China has been an important competitor and obviously a role model, and in recent times an adversary. I think when China began its reforms, and we have so much to learn from them, they have shifted 400 million people from farm to non-farm, and that's probably the world's biggest poverty reduction or the world's most effective minimum wage program that has ever been run. But when they started their reforms in 1978, Deng Xiaoping was very, very skilled, but he was also very lucky. He caught a 30-year super cycle of global growth. He got a 30-year super cycle of global openness to trade and global deconstruction of manufacturing supply chains. And if you think of India right now in 2020, we would love to do export-driven manufacturing growth, but I think manufacturing has changed and exports have changed. This is not export pessimism. You know, a lot of people view Atmanirbhar as export pessimism. I think that there's a realization that the world will not be growing at 3.5% for 30 years as it did when China was. I think the world COVID is reinforcing some of the sort of barriers to trade, if not just Trump is doing that. And I think that manufacturing is much less employment intensive than it used to be. See, the peak of any country's labor force in manufacturing was Britain in World War II. It was 45%. America peaked at 33, China peaked at 28. India's labor force in manufacturing is 11%. Now, I don't think we'll ever get to 45, 33, or 28. The question is, can you get to 18 or 19? And what turns out, at least looking back, that Make in India is turning out to be Make for India. You know, the $64 billion in foreign direct investment last year was clustered in manufacturing, and it was clustered in areas where domestic markets are getting to critical mass. So I guess I don't think the role of the government is to set things on fire. It is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion. So I think that this is an active debate, even within the government, that should we be sort of picking winners and losers? Does industrial policy work? We've seen that movie before. It didn't. I mean, essentially the license Raj for India meant that our labor was handicapped without capital and our capital was handicapped without labor. But I think China's lessons for some people seem to suggest that, animals bred in captivity don't always, I mean, our view after the license Raj is that animals bred in captivity don't survive in the jungle. So competition is really important. And I think that hopefully Atmanirbhar Bharat is not about closing ourselves off to the world, but it is about figuring out whether our domestic consumption can be satisfied with higher levels of domestic supply chains. I don't think anybody is imagining Atmanirbhar Bharat as the 1955 Avadi resolution imagined self-reliance, or the 1956 second five-year plan articulated that. I think that there is a second wave of rethinking about globalization, and it is just that if you have a large domestic market, small tweaks at the margin can really move supply chains. And if it's possible to do that, I hope. Now, will there be some damage in the eyes of free trade purists in the short run? I think there will be, but I think that the notion that India should stay at 11% manufacturing, even when it gets to the $10,000 per capita income. Today we're at $2,500. China is at 10, and we have to be really in awe of what they have done. So the long answer is no. Atmanirbhar is not 1955, but it is not exactly the view of the 1990s that by bringing our tariffs down to zero, by importing all our manufacturing, we can somehow do our farm to non-farm transition purely to services and consumption. I think that there's a little bit of question around that. As with any hypothesis, time will tell. But I think there's a lot more listening going on. So this is not ideological. There are a lot of economists and a lot of trade economists and a lot of businesses who believe that with the margins of 5–10%, you could actually make some difference to supply chains.
Okay, thank you.
Anjali, may I ask a question, please?
Absolutely, please, Pradeep.
Manish, thank you very much. Your flow of introduction was so mind-boggling, and it bowled me over. I don't know about the others, but you have a lot of figures, facts, and you have a lot of statistics. So you know exactly what ails us. I mean, you gave an example of China, and you kept saying that if we are to compare with it. So I don't want to be facetious or cynical. The question over here is, when we give something a name, like I think my biggest complaint is that we gave a name of OS, and OBCs and stuff like that. You can never get rid. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
You can never get rid of something if you brand it. Now we've given this name ease of doing business. The biggest obstacle to me is me. If I get out of my way, I'm sure I'll progress very well. That's basically it. So why is it that we cannot do what you said China is doing? We heard 20 years ago about how they would roll out the red carpet for Nokia to president. He just had to sit in his hotel room and everything was done for him. Here we had single window clearance, but the window kept so large, it stretched from one end of Ayakar Bhavan to the other. So how, in a nutshell, without the words that we use, how can we get out of our way and just get going? Let industry prosper.
Yeah. So I think that in the short run, we can rationalize, we can decriminalize, and we can digitize, and our lives will become much easier. We can do a universal enterprise number. Today, almost all Indians have an Aadhaar number, but I have 36 different numbers issued by the government. So the universal enterprise number was actually announced in a budget 2 years ago, but government departments are unwilling to give up their numbers because obviously that creates control. So I would submit that the most important civil reform for ease of doing business is civil service reform. And that's why I have been for a long time concluded that, and this starts with structure. We don't need 55 ministries in Delhi. Japan only has 8 cabinet ministers, US has 14 cabinet ministers, and UK has 22 cabinet ministers. I don't think the Ministry of Steel does anything other than lord over SAIL. I think the Department of Heavy Enterprises does nothing other than lord over public sector units, whose market cap in the last 10 years has gone from 30% of India's market to 6% of India's market capitalization. I mean, now we can go on and on about the efficacy. There are 250 people in New Delhi with the rank of Secretary of Government of India. So why I broke this ease of doing business up into saying there is a short-term project on rationalize, decriminalize, and digitize. But I think all of us have now acknowledged that the only way to do ease of doing business on a sustainable basis is to figure out how to do civil service reform. There are 20 million civil servants. There are only 4,700 IAS officers, but 99% of them are ranked outstanding officially, right? Mathematically, everybody can't be above average, so that's not possible. So I think some fear of falling, some hope of rising, introducing the colonel threshold of the army where you retire at joint secretary if you're not shortlisted for promotion, having some kind of 20-60-20 curve, obviously better training. And I think 20 million sort of civil, so the mentality of prohibited till permitted is also a culture which has sort of been built up, right? And, you know, this is one argument. You know, I was born and brought up in Kashmir. I wish Patel had won the Kashmir argument, but I wish Nehru had won the civil service argument with Patel. You know, Nehru used to say the Indian Civil Service, the ICS, is neither Indian nor civil nor a service. But Patel had this view of the steel frame. And the steel frame has become a steel cage. So I would submit that I have been taking on that battle of civil service reform for a long time. And I think there is more consensus that is needed. I think politics is becoming more competitive. So politicians are listening more about lateral entry, about civil service reform. But it hasn't reached critical mass because obviously nobody cuts the tree they're sitting on, and, you know, the civil service and DOPT and everybody control. So I think that instead of taking on the civil service reform, which is at the heart of ease of doing business, I think rationalize, decriminalize, and digitize would be the first stage. And in parallel, these ideas are again all embedded in the last Administrative Reforms Commission by Moli, or the third one before that. So again, the idea of what to do in civil service reform has been well documented, but we will need a politician to get really frustrated with civil servants and say, I need to reinvent this, this frame which has become a cage completely. I think we're getting there. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that the COVID also exposes how generalist civil servants might not focus on execution or might not be able to execute stuff. You know, we always hold up the election as great execution by the civil service, but a health crisis is probably a better demonstration of some of the incompetence. So my sense is that civil service reform is needed for ease of doing business, but we won't get that in the next sort of short term. So let's have an ease of doing business, which is rationalize, decriminalize, and digitize.
Thanks, Manish. I wish you can do it quickly. I don't have much time.
Anjali, Sumit here. Can I come in with a question?
Please, certainly, Sumit. Please do.
Hi, Manish. Thanks so much for your very, very interesting talk. Bombay Chamber has taken a lot of interest in the last 2 years in promoting mediation as a alternative process for resolving disputes. And since we are talking about ease of doing business, in which I understand enforcing contracts vis-a-vis delays in litigation in courts has a very important place. What's your view on mediation per se? Do you think mediation, as it is different from arbitration, has a role to play in Indian commercial disputes, and what's holding back adopting mediation in India vis-a-vis the some of the Western countries?
I mean, there are 40 million court cases, there are 1.4 million court cases, new ones every month. There is no question that online dispute resolution or mediation or arbitration are really important sort of missing angles. especially in two areas of consumer disputes and employer and employee disputes. You know, consumer disputes are small value, they become hard to pursue, and very often it just needs a calm voice to hear both sides and sort of come up with a trade-off, not a conflict. And the same thing is in employee and employer law. I think it has not taken off in employee and employer law because of India's labor laws. You know, you can't comply with 100% of India's labor laws unless you violate 10% of them. You know, there's 17 definitions of wages, there are 22 definitions of workers, there are 19 definitions of enterprises. So I think that mediation works well when the transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced are not very huge. See, this is also a reason why foreigners get freaked out, right? Most of us in India recognize that, you know, how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced is different. But the China factory refugee who wants to move from China will look at the law as how it is written. And so that's what makes us, how the law is written is bizarre or unacceptable, but how it is interpreted, practiced, and enforced, you know, people who multinationals who have been in India have made peace with that. So I would submit that a bunch of sort of labor reform is really important for, say, mediation to come back to employer-employee relationships. You know, I was born and brought up in Kashmir, right? You know, Miyan Bibi Razi to kya karega Qazi is clearly, you would cut a huge amount of clog on employment cases and consumer dispute cases with mediation and resolution. In fact, on Saturday, there was the Niti Aayog panel on online dispute resolution, which was very interesting, and they put their recording. I would urge you to look at that. But no question that courts at 1.3 million new cases a month cannot handle India's complexity. So while we wait for labor reform and sort of law reform, mediation, arbitration are very important things that you can do. And unfortunately, all private equity contracts are written with arbitration and mediation in Singapore now. And it's clear that, you know, Gujarat Gift City is trying to do some international mediation in India. But if Bombay Chamber of Commerce can build that, that would be a gift to just overall formal job creation, contract enforcement, and I think investment cycle also.
Can I ask a question, Anjali?
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping an eye on the clock, Neera.
Yeah. You know, you're absolutely the right person to answer this question. You know, with so much of employment that you have been able to handle over the last so many years, you know, unemployment or underemployment or whatever you might say, poverty is a big issue in India. In this context, really, do you think women would really end up working? I mean, the way the numbers are going down, I mean, just to get one person working in a family, you know, a man, and you know how our psyches are more tuned towards that. Unlike the developed countries, we are just talking like them because they needed labor force. We don't really need our labor force, extra labor force. And adding women to the workforce is really not something that we really need in numbers. So where is this? How do you handle this dichotomy? It's all right to say that they, you know, it's their aspiration. They're 50% of the people, all that blah, 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 blah. But technically speaking, the numbers don't speak in their favor. So how do you handle this?
I think we can't handle the two shock absorbers of India's labor market have been self-employment and farm employment, right? 45% of our labor force in agriculture generates only 14% of our GDP, and 50% of our labor is technically self-employed. They're not self-employed, they're self-exploiting, right? There was this idiot Russian economist in 1924, Chayanov, who convinced Nehru that small farms are viable because you don't pay yourself a salary, your kids a salary, or your spouse a salary. Now, this is the lump of labor fallacy, which continues to believe that India has a jobs problem or an unemployment problem. India's unemployment rate has not been a fudge since 1947, and it's been between 5.5% and 8.5%. Most Western economies would kill for that level of consistency between 5 and 8%. Spain is at 14. So I would submit that if you think India has a jobs problem, you'll throw money from helicopters, you'll mandate a 3-day work week, you will take away people's tractors and give them spoons to dig with. Because people are bhuka nanga pyasa, right? But if you think that India has a wages problem, which is what I think we have, Then you will focus on productivity of firms, productivity of states, and productivity of individuals, right? I mean, I live in Karnataka. We have 1/3 the number of people of UP, yet our GDP is the same. The World Bank just did a report on manufacturing firms. There's a 22 times difference in productivity between manufacturing firms at the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile of size. And obviously, a good plumber gets paid 5 times more than an average plumber. A good software engineer gets 50 times more than an average software engineer. And a good CEO gets 200 times more than a bad CEO. So the skill premium is quite obvious. So I would submit that the women's labor force participation in India reflects the lack of formalization, lack of urbanization, lack of financialization, and lack of industrialization. And obviously the lack of skilling, right? 200. So I would submit that let's not assume that there is anything cultural about our women's labor force participation. And let's not assume there is a demand constraint. I mean, we could easily incorporate 200 million people into the workforce if we skilled India, formalized it, urbanized it, financialized it, and industrialized it. I mean, urbanization is a very important part of labor force participation. India only has 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China has 375. We have 6 lakh villages. 2 lakh of those villages have less than 200 people. You're not going to be able to take jobs to people. You have to take people to jobs. So this whole migration is not a bug, it's a feature. It's called development. China migrated 300 million people. So I would submit that I have no questions in my mind that India we don't have to depend on the world to get to $10,000 per capita income. Let's just fix our land, labor, capital markets, and let us get rid of the regulatory cholesterol. Now, can we get to $30,000 or $40,000? We'll see. You know, technology is madly deflationary. Maybe $20,000 is the new $40,000. But I would submit that we have nobody else to blame and no other binding constraints other than ourselves to take our $2,500 per capita income to the 10,000, right? India is 5th in the world in total GDP, but we are 138th in the world in per capita GDP. And I think COVID shows us that per capita GDP matters, but per capita GDP is about productivity. So no, I don't think that, I think we need our women back in the labor force. I think we need to take people off farms, and I think we need less self-employment in India. And the only way you do that is by a massive investment cycle in non-farm formal job creation. And that needs formalization, urbanization, industrialization. I say those 5 points together again and again, because doing one of them is not enough. You know, we need to shift from classical physics, which was discrete systems, to quantum physics, where everything is interrelated. So skilling depends on urbanization, industrialization depends on financialization, and formalization depends on all of them.
Thanks. Your words are very reassuring. Thank you.
Manish, this has been truly fantastic. I dare say that perhaps since the late Nani Palkhiwala, at least I haven't come across in a single speech, a speaker covering such a wide spectrum of facts, figures, and connecting the dots across so many disciplines.
Absolutely true.
It was just such a treat, really.
Absolute treat.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Very enriching indeed. And three.
You can rattle off, remember figures and numbers and statistics. Amazing. Amazing.
Absolutely amazing.
And we have to thank Anjali really to bring Manish here before us. So really that was a fantastic opportunity. I think, Manish, the 3 words which continue to ring the bell: rationalize, decriminalize, and digitize. I mean, it is fair to say that at least the digitization, as we all know, has been progressing reasonably well in our country. It's interesting on decriminalization, as you know, many of our members know, some of our chamber and Bharat Vasanis here have been involved in some of those initiatives to decriminalize some of our laws. I think a lot more needs to be done, as you rightly pointed out. I think it's the rationalization and the administrative reforms which you talked about. That perhaps arguably is the area which is crying for far more attention and reform. I remember when Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister in his first term, he mentioned about this as a priority. Obviously, I don't think that kind of happened. So really great points. I would just add that, as you pointed out, the quality of legislation and the impact of legislation on society, on business. Maybe we need to do a lot of work in those two areas as well. And why it matters is, as you rightly pointed out, that especially external investors and everybody else looks at the letter of the law and is not just going to be comforted by practice. And therefore, quality of legislation and the business impact, the societal impact, if that can be given more attention, that would be great. But great points. I think we picked up a lot of ideas, and I'm sure it will help the chamber in one of our missions, as I explained in the beginning of the session. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining in. Hope we all benefited from this session and look forward to staying connected.